Barry, thank you very much for that warm welcome. It's a great honour to be in Singapore, a privilege to be talking in this distinguished public lecture program. As Australia's Foreign Minister, I'd quoted several times an acute observation by Lee Kuan Yew. It was on the question of the future character of China. He said, and I quote, "Peace and security in the Asia-Pacific will turn on whether China emerges as a xenophobic, chauvinistic force, bitter and hostile to the West because it tried to slow down or abort its development, or whether it is educated and involved in the ways of the world, more cosmopolitan, more internationalised and outward-looking," unquote. That's a great challenge, and when I ceased to be Foreign Minister, I thought, in the spirit of that quote from Lee Kuan Yew, I should set myself up from a position to see this great drama played out. How will China develop? What will be the trajectory? What will be the character of domestic Chinese power? What personality will China demonstrate on the world stage, in this region especially? What are the implications for Australia and its friends like Singapore? For Australia, foreign affairs and defence are getting serious again. That point was made only recently when Hillary Clinton, promoting a book, made some comments about Australia's position. She said on June 27 that the push for more trade between Australia and China, quote, "makes Australia dependent to an extent that can undermine freedom of movement and sovereignty, economic and political." She went on to say it's a mistake, whether you're a country or a company or an individual, to put, as we say in the vernacular, all your eggs in the one basket. Her comments brought a brisk response from a minister in the federal government in Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. He said, "I'm sure we'd love to export vast quantities of iron ore to the United States, but they've never shown any enthusiasm in buying them." The same week, coincidentally, there was a response from a Chinese source. Visiting the Australian National University, Professor Wu Jinbo, the Executive Dean of the Institute of International Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai, addressed this question from the other side. He said there were limits to the extent to which Australia could tighten strategic cooperation with the United States without putting its relationship with China at risk. That's the first time I can remember a comment like this from a Chinese source. Well, we can't bridle at the bluntness of this Chinese academic. I mean, we've presented the Chinese with a few challenges from time to time when I'm sure the interests of Beijing were piqued when WikiLeaks revealed that our former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd was reported to have told Hillary Clinton in March 2009 that he is a brutal realist on China and supported a policy of integrating China into the international community, all the while also preparing to deploy force if everything goes wrong. He went on to say that the proposed strengthening of Australia's Navy was a response to China's growing ability to project forces. And he said with bluntness that Chinese leaders were sub-rational and deeply emotional when it came to Taiwan. In 2009, there was a defence white paper from Australia about military modernisation and pitching things in terms of responding to the re-emergence of Chinese power. Edward Luttwak, in his 2012 book, The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy, said this. I was shocked when I read it, this summation of Australia's position in the world. He said this, quote, "For all Australia's ever-increasing ethnic diversity, it fully retains the Anglo-Saxon trait of bellicosity. It's not surprising, therefore, that Australia has been the first country to clearly express resistance to China's rising power and to initiate the coalition building against it that's mandated by the logic of strategy," unquote. I spent a week asking some of my colleagues in the federal government, I said, "Have you read this Luttwak book? Were you conscious when you brought out the Defence White Paper this is before I was in federal politics, that this was all a pitch to counter the rise of China. They didn't quite see it in the terms that Luttwak had presented it. The Gillard government in November 2011 hosted a visit to Australia by President Obama. In the Australian Parliament, he criticised the Chinese model of growth. Later, he and the Australian Prime Minister announced that there'd be a rotation of 2,500 American Marines every year through northern Australia. It brought a criticism from a former Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who said on TV, "China's not the old Soviet Union, and we'd make, of course, a huge mistake seeking to contain it." This was a speech, he meant the President's speech in the Australian Parliament, that really would have been better made in Washington or elsewhere. Here we are in our Parliament, not the American Parliament, our Parliament. The American President gets up and says the Chinese model will fail, it's bound to fail. And then all the speech is basically hard rhetoric against China, unquote. That was the response of a former Australian Prime Minister to the US President choosing to make criticism of China in the Australian Parliament. I was a private citizen at that time, and I said on my blog, like me, the former Prime Minister does not object to a rotating troop presence in Australia's north, but is concerned about how it gets wrapped up in an unmistakable anti-Chinese stance. Why is it remotely in Australia's interest to take that course? Unquote. My views at the time. It wasn't about us being committed to the US alliance. It was a matter of the way we express that alliance, about how prominent we render it part of our international character. And this is a theme I'll return to. When I became Foreign Minister in March 2012, I was very much of the view that our next annual talks with the Americans, the first after this Marines announcement and the President's visit, it was probably appropriate to avoid another shock headline-grabbing announcement about stepped up strategic cooperation with the Americans. That was the view I reached. It was worthwhile, not a year after the Marines announcement, not to jam suggestions of still more Australia-US strategic cooperation into the headlines. The sort of increased cooperation with the US was proceeding anyway. It was a matter of whether we make it look like this was the fullest expression of Australia's national character, our international personality, or whether we're able to remodulate and go easy on that theme, at least for some time. I recall in Beijing on my first visit being challenged by the then Foreign Minister about this decision on Marines in Northern Australia, and he saw that, the Chinese saw it as a tightening of Cold War ties. My response was, just as we attempt to understand China's foreign policy through its history, it's important to see Australia's foreign policy in the same light. And here's one very bold generalisation about Australia and its foreign policy. Australians have always aligned themselves with the dominant maritime power of our region and, as it happens, the world. And I suppose that's just a fancy way of saying we were happily part of the British Empire while the British Empire was around, and we never contemplated a declaration of independence from the Empire. The Empire left us. We didn't leave it. And after the Second World War, we settled on a security treaty with the US. I had an irreverent left-wing friend in the Australian Senate, he was, back in the 1960s, and he said, he joked, we went from being a crown colony to a banana republic. He seemed to imply without skipping a heartbeat. The Australian-American alliance is strongly supported by Australian public opinion, and even when America had a president who was deeply unpopular in Australia, I'm referring to George W. Bush, the alliance with the US still had deep support in Australia, the Australian people drawing a distinction between a president who would be gone after 2 terms were up and a security alliance that was in our country's long-term interest. The Chinese agreed in 2013 to have their leadership meet our leadership on a guaranteed annual basis. And they asked us to call this a strategic partnership. And we did. John Howard, a former Australian Prime Minister, stepped back from a strategic partnership with China because he said, when it happens, I want it to be meaningful. He said, I don't want to say we've got a strategic partnership with the Chinese and then not have any substance in our relationship. And I think we face a challenge in Australia of fleshing out what that strategic partnership with China should mean. A government, a new Australian government elected a year ago, inherited this challenge. I think the Abbott government, elected in September last year, has gone through 3 phases in China policy. The first phase was a period of assertiveness or missteps. The Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, described Japan as our best friend in Asia. There was a shift in language. Up till that time, we'd used something less forceful, like we've got no closer friend in Asia than Japan. On November 26, 2013, the government responded to China's declaration of an air defence identification zone over the East China Sea. It called in the Chinese ambassador in Canberra. It announced publicly that it had done this. We were tougher than other like-minded countries, such as New Zealand, Canada and Singapore. On November the 28th, 2013, Tony Abbott even baptised Australia as a strong ally of Japan. He compared our alliance with Japan with our alliance with America. And that's the first time an Australian Prime Minister has used such language. And in fact, we're not an ally of Japan. Up till now, we've described Japan as a friend and a partner or a strategic partner. The second phase came, and it was a phase of correction, when Prime Minister Abbott visited Japan and China. There's no more talk of Japan being an ally, Japan being our closest friend, and he said in China that we were there to be a friend and to work hard on a free trade agreement. And in May, when tension arose between China and Vietnam over the positioning of a deep-water drilling rig, the response of the Australian government was fairly low-key, understated. It said Australia doesn't take a position, we urge both sides, etc., etc. You know the diplomatic language. But when Prime Minister Abe of Japan visited Australia in July this year, the government seemed to remodulate again, a third phase in Australia-China relations. The atmosphere around the Japanese Prime Minister's visit suggests an elevation in Japanese-Australian ties. In this atmosphere, one Australian reporter excitedly but wrongly reported that Australia was entering a security pact with Japan. In fact, the communique from the meetings referred to a defence equipment and technology agreement long under discussion. The visit came, of course, at a time when Japan has revised its policy on use of its armed forces, when South Korea, as much as China, notes nationalist currents in Japanese politics, confirmed by those woeful visits to Yasukuni Shrine, and when tensions between Japan and China are running strongly. It's not unreasonable to ask 2 questions. Is Australia elevating trilateral engagement with Japan and the United States? And are we veering to some kind of informal or quasi-treaty between Australia and Japan? We've got a huge stake in a constructive relationship with China. And I said at the outset, watching the character of China as its wealth and power increases and looking at how we can help shape that character is a key challenge for Australia. Viewing from an Australian perspective a territorial dispute about the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands is an opportunity for us to repeat again. We've got no stake in sovereignty here. We want a peaceful and lawful resolution of the dispute, and in both sides showing restraint. But why should Australia incline, in appearance or in reality, to one side over the other? I believe we should not only be neutral, we should carefully cultivate and reiterate that neutrality. By this test, it would be considered unwise that Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott even attended a meeting of Japan's National Security Council during his visit in April, unless, of course, He'd planned a mirror image attendance at a meeting of China's National Security Commission. And why not? Our neutrality needs to be nurtured and rewoven. This is the truest expression of our national interest. And such a stance maximises our opportunity to urge both sides, as a friend of both, to avoid abrupt moves and to manage this dispute. In my role as director of this think tank, I've commissioned a paper, East China Sea, Does ANZUS Apply? Would our security treaty with the United States pull us into a conflict, into a showdown in which America moved to back the Japanese? The Australian Defence Minister said in Tokyo on June the 12th, I don't believe it does. And I think the Australian people would rest easy with that interpretation. They would believe it to be common sense. They would hope he's not going to be overruled by any security advisor in the Prime Minister's office. It comes down to what kind of an ally of the US we choose to be. I quoted in my recently published diaries the spectrum of advice, the range of advice that an Australian foreign minister gets on this. Among that spectrum was a former Australian diplomat, Paul O'Sullivan, who said we should aspire to be a different kind of ally of the US. That is, one that is consistently in the US camp, one that's supportive at all times. But another senior diplomat, indeed a head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, now head of the Department of Defence, Dennis Richardson, said, our interests are different from those of a great power. Our interests are different from those of a great power. Both positions are arguable. But in the context of the dispute in the East China Sea, the Richardson formulation, our interests are different from a great power, is what should guide Australian policy. The East China Sea is clearly a case of the interest of the US, a power with global responsibilities and a treaty with Japan being different from Australia's. We are not a great power, but a G20 member middle power with a strong economic stake in China's peaceful and prosperous rise. We're warm to Japan and its values, but like all its friends, have reservations about nationalist currents in its politics. Unlike America, we are not Japan's ally. If there were a conflict between China and Japan, in which the US committed itself to Japan, Australia would not be involved in any military action until our cabinet decided to be. It would not be automatic. Cabinet consideration would be shaped by the nature of the crisis and how it came about. There are likely to be a number of off-ramps before it came to an Australian commitment or an American request. Our economic integration with China is striking. It reminds us of what we have to lose if there's going to be chronic tension in East Asia, reversing, compromising decades of solid economic growth. China is going to have a middle class 850 million people larger than what it has at the present time, a middle class 4 times bigger than today. It's not unreasonable for Australia to take account of the core interests of a country that makes such a big contribution to our economic well-being, where these core interests align with international norms. In this spirit, it's probably useful to imagine how the Chinese might interpret the various shifts and inconsistencies in Australian utterances. The Chinese might think we've got an obligation to explain to them the sentiments in our 2009 Defence White Paper, or what we might mean by a hedging strategy. We routinely say to the Chinese we want them to explain what they mean by their defence build-up or its territorial claims in the South China Sea, and we want them to relate those claims to international law. It's not unreasonable for us to explain ourselves to the Chinese. That was my response during the questions raised by the 2,500 Marines being rotated through the Northern Territory. And it's a point made by a former Australian ambassador to Beijing, Jeff Raby, who said, and I quote, China understands that we and others would want to hedge against some unexpected events in China. It may not openly welcome this, but again, as realists, they would do the same. To execute a hedging strategy effectively and not create mutual suspicion and hostility, it is important to have a solid basis of trust between China and us. We should be able to speak openly to China about these issues. We should not be reticent in explaining our hedging to China, but we must also be credible. We can't seek to engage China on these issues and then send China conflicting messages about whether we see them as friend or foe. And just to revisit the case study I touched on earlier about whether we should announce a raft of new strategic cooperation with Americans on defence, ship visits, plane visits, I formed the view that a year after that announcement on the Marines, it was appropriate to modulate, I think a useful verb, expressions of security cooperation with the US and to settle on a policy of steady as she goes rather than generating a new raft of headlines about stepped-up strategic cooperation. As it happened, that suited the US. Here I think my instincts as Minister were broader than any simple desire to placate China. It comes to this. Australians don't need to project their alliance with the US in every setting, including our relations with Southeast Asia, until it becomes the only expression of our international personality. I think this is an even more useful bit of advice to the current Australian government than to the last. Yet it's got to be said the US alliance runs very deep with Australians. All the more reason, I'd argue, not to render it a cliché or a caricature. It goes back to the early years of the 20th century when Japan defeated Russia in the War of 1904 and 1905. Australia, a small population, a vast continent, witnessed the rise of Japanese power and wanted America involved more deeply in the region. In the 1930s, we were alarmed by the robustness or otherwise of the Singapore strategy, and we started to engage with China, Japan and Southeast Asia, sending the Minister for External Affairs at the time, John Latham, on a goodwill mission. And he told the Australian Parliament back in 1934, when we were still so much part of the British Empire, that we have to engage with what to Europe is the Far East, but to us, the Near North, the Near East to us. He said it's inevitable that the relations between Australia and the Near East will become closer and more intimate as the years pass. It's important we should endeavour to develop and improve our relations with our near neighbours whose fortunes are so important to us, not only in economic matters but also in relation to vital issues of peace and war. That was a pre-echo of Australia's post-war commitment to Asia, and it was also based on engaging America more deeply in the region. The darkest day in Australian history was the fall of Singapore in February 1942. A land army of 20,000 Australians marched into captivity, and Australia looked to America without restraint or inhibitions. And a month after the fall of Singapore, the Australian public, with enormous relief, welcomed General Douglas MacArthur to Australia. He wasn't there with a treaty to offer Australia, but he was there to use Australia as a base to roll back the Japanese in Asia, and Australia welcomed him as a hero. Support for the American alliance is deposited in the Australian DNA, and it's reinforced by common values. As Minister for Foreign Affairs, I sat in the General Assembly in September 2012, and Barack Obama, during Leaders' Week at the UN, stood up and he dedicated his speech to the American ambassador in Libya who'd been murdered a short time before, Jeff Stevens. And he was wrestling the President with the resentment of the Muslim world with attacks on Islam. You might remember that YouTube video clip mocking the religion. And the President was telling Arab friends of the United States, Muslim friends of the United States, that America couldn't contemplate censorship in response to an attack on religion. He said, and I quote, "We believe that freedom and self-determination are not unique to one culture. They are not simply American values or Western values. They are universal values. He then said, I know there are some who ask why we don't just ban such a video. The answer is enshrined in our laws. Our Constitution protects the right to practice free speech. Here in the United States, countless publications provoke offence. Like me, the majority of Americans are Christian, and yet we do not ban blasphemy against our most sacred beliefs. We do so not because we support hateful speech, but because our founders understood that without such protections, the capacity of each individual to express his own views and practice their own faith may be threatened. We do so because in a diverse society, efforts to restrict speech can become a tool to silence critics or oppress minorities. We do so because, given the power of faith in our lives and the passion that religious differences can inflame, the strongest weapon against hateful speech is not repression, it's more speech. The voices of tolerance that rally against bigotry and blasphemy and lift up the values of understanding and mutual respect." Unquote. And as I heard that speech, I was impressed by the mastery of the language. As I heard the speech, I felt again the charm, the pulling power, the appeal of American values, I should say quickly, American values at their best, their most generous and noble, as opposed to quirks like the American commitment to universal gun ownership or the religiosity that's woven through American culture. One Australian businessman told me, in simple summation, that there'd never be a question for Australians. We would always prefer American values. He seemed to imply over Chinese values. When I raised this Obama speech with Henry Kissinger, he reminded me that universal values, the freedom of speech that the President was talking about, for example, and elevating as a universal value, don't exist in the Chinese worldview. Chinese civilization enunciates codes of behaviour, not principles for spreading democracy. One only has to look at the recently published survey of American foreign policy from Truman to Obama. It's in a book called Maximalist by Stephen Sestanovich, to be reminded of the audacious uniqueness and ambition of the post-World War II American mission, this notion that America exists to spread democracy around the world. Or, as Hillary Clinton herself wrote in a recent review of Kissinger's new book, World Order, Ms. Clinton said, "What comes through clearly is a conviction that we and President Obama share, a belief in the indispensability of continued American leadership in service of a just and liberal order. There really is no viable alternative. No other nation can bring together the necessary coalitions and provide the necessary capabilities to meet today's complex global threats. But this leadership is not a birthright. It is a responsibility that must be assumed with determination and humility by each generation," unquote. And there again, the uniqueness of America taking upon itself, as no power in history has, no previous empire, if you want to use that term, to promote values around the world. Australians are attracted to it, even when, as over the Iraq War, they have reservations about some of the enthusiasms that drive Americans. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, for example, Prime Minister from 75 to 83, in his recent book, Dangerous Allies, talks about the risk of Australia being drawn into wars in Asia that it doesn't want. He talks about the embedding of Australian military leadership in American military entities. The frigate HMAS Sydney with the US 7th Fleet, and the appointment of an Australian general as one of two deputy commanders in the US Pacific Command, headquartered in Hawaii. Fraser's position is that this is the threat to our independence as a country, and I believe it's something we've got to consider carefully. It's a serious contribution to get us thinking and to get Australians debating about risks embedded in our alliance with America. On the other side of the argument, there are defence experts who point out that other countries have a similar integration with the US, Canada, New Zealand. Singapore, of course, builds defence connections without any assumption that these mean an automatic commitment in the event of a showdown somewhere else in the world. Still, to push in the opposite direction a moment, a former Conservative Foreign Minister in Australia, Alexander Downer, said to me, "If you want a Cold War with China, you will get a Cold War with China." He was making warnings about self-fulfilling prophecies. It would be a mistake for Australian Conservatives, I'm thinking now of the Abbott government, to think that somehow Washington requires them to relegate our relationship building with Beijing to satisfy Washington, even if that recent comment by Hillary Clinton sort of hinted at that. Someone who served Hillary Clinton, Kurt Campbell, said to me after I briefed him on our strategic partnership with China, he said, "Well, it's okay." He said, quote, "Australia should be the most desired girl on the block," unquote. In other words, we don't have to choose. We can be courted by both America and China. And of course, we can weave through all these considerations a recognition that, as Prime Minister Lee said in 2014, the US has been in Asia, quote, "a benign and constructive power," unquote. And to complicate the picture further, this is another cross-current worth identifying, we should remember, and I'm sure Singaporeans have thought about this, that the US-China relationship involves bonds that are forged over decades. It is a very robust bilateral relationship. It runs very strongly. There is self-interest on both sides. And a Chinese strategist seeking to challenge Australians, or for that matter Singaporeans, might point out that the Japanese could find themselves isolated if they pushed too hard and found their truculence was too much for the US, their nationalism too much for the US. I think it's worthwhile to remind ourselves of the importance of the sophisticated, complicated relationship between the US and China, the most important bilateral relationship in the world. And just to think for a moment that if the two great powers settled on interests in common, the rest of us conceivably could find ourselves elbowed to one side. So these are the complications we pick our way through. And Chinese foreign policy can be expected to develop. I deal at this in some length in my printed paper, which will be available to you. But just to summarise, one thing to watch is the extent to which China will contribute to public goods in international security. Involvement in anti-piracy operations, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, capacity building, stabilisation, peacekeeping. Coincidentally, I saw on CCTV last night a reference to China's involvement in peacekeeping around the world. There's strong evidence of China, like India, having a growing role in contributing to security public goods, and it's been noted by observers. Just push further a moment. Gareth Evans, an Australian Foreign Minister who took a big role in developing the notion of responsibility to protect, is quite optimistic about Chinese foreign policy circles contemplating an active Chinese engagement with this principle. I imagine some would be sceptical, but Gareth Evans argues that after talking to Chinese about it, he detects that Chinese are thinking about how you deal after Syria, after Libya, with some of the hardest mass atrocity cases. He found that among his Chinese interlocutors there was a widespread acceptance that the responsibility to protect doctrine, unanimously agreed by the UN General Assembly in 2005, is here to stay. Further, the majority sentiment among his Chinese partners had moved on from the days when the Chinese saw responsibility to protect as a mere cloak for Western intervention. There has been a loss of consensus in the Security Council concerning how to respond to events in Syria, and that reflects the way China and Russia observed what happened in Libya in 2011. France, the UK, the US had been given a Security Council mandate to protect civilians based on this principle of responsibility to protect, but as Russia and China saw it, they then pursued full regime change in Libya. But Gareth Evans detects, notwithstanding this, among the Chinese, widespread agreement about how consensus within the Security Council on the hardest cases might be recreated. And the Chinese argue that the principle should be enriched by acceptance of a complementary principle called responsible protection, a notion floated by a Chinese scholar last year. Tougher criteria to be satisfied before a military mandate's provided, and tougher supervision. Now, it's interesting that there is Chinese engagement with something that we might be inclined to see as very difficult for Chinese foreign policy to absorb. Gareth warns that while it remains to be seen whether China will ever champion the idea of responsible protection in an upfront fashion, it would be desirable that if they do, it should be welcomed as a move to expand Chinese foreign policy preoccupations, a crucial notion, and to assume co-ownership of R2P. In terms of getting serious about saying never again to mass atrocity crimes, that's about as positive a development as anyone could hope for. So here we are considering ways in which Chinese foreign policy could broaden and change as China develops greater power. And we return again to the challenge posed by Lee Kuan Yew. How's the Chinese story going to unfold? The quote I started with at the very outset. In a xenophobic, chauvinistic direction, bitter and hostile to the West because the West tried to slow it down or contain it, or more cosmopolitan, more internationalised and more outward-looking. The drama of China and the US and Asia is not the only Asian story, and it's good to remind ourselves of this. We have other relationships, Australia, Singapore. As Shakespeare's Coriolanus put it, there is a world elsewhere. And one of those worlds is ASEAN. One Australian academic says, thought-provokingly, when I'm asked China or the US, I answer ASEAN. And certainly the Australian government, under Tony Abbott, has pointed to the importance of ASEAN, with the now Prime Minister saying before the elections he wants more Jakarta and less Geneva in Australian foreign policy. By less Geneva, he meant less involvement in internationalism, in multilateralism, I should say, something that he saw us in the Labor Party as being too dewy-eyed about. The Australian diplomatic attention to the world of Southeast Asia runs strong, and I think, except for one lapse, quickly corrected, Australia's been keen to emphasise ASEAN centrality. During my time as Foreign Minister, I was pleased to be able to appoint our first full-time ambassador to ASEAN, but more importantly, tried to align Australian foreign policy with ASEAN positions where it was in our interests. For example, it was clearly in our interest to open up to Myanmar. In June 2012, I told President Thein Sein that Australia would lift its sanctions. I was expressing the position that had been pioneered by ASEAN. I committed to lobby other nations in the UN to get them to change the language of that resolution they adopted every year out of the General Assembly, condemning Myanmar for abuses, but giving it little credit for the path that Thein Sein had led it on, had taken it along. Moreover, I undertook helping Myanmar to lobby European foreign ministers to have them lift and not simply leave suspended their sanctions on the country. I saw Australia become the biggest provider of aid to Myanmar, the aid flowing overwhelmingly to education. This was Australia moving in behind ASEAN, supporting a reformer, Thein Sein, in his difficult mission of transition. We fall down when it comes to ASEAN in two respects. We're not getting enough young Australians learning Asian languages, and that's a difficult public policy challenge. As Premier of New South Wales, I ran a big school system, and I don't know how you get youngsters, even at the point of a bayonet, on a hot, muggy Thursday afternoon in a school somewhere in New South Wales to go in and master Mandarin. I'm looking at ways of approaching this. Given that China is our biggest source of migrants, building language study, building Chinese as a community language, and seeing that the sons and daughters of Chinese families living in Australia don't lose the family language might be the best way of building communities of of Mandarin language speakers, and that would apply to other Asian languages. And Australian business is not as deeply engaged in the ASEAN world as I think any one of us would like. They're challenges for Australia. But we face, looking at Southeast Asia, challenges as formidable as they are in looking at the future of China. Will the other 9 ASEAN nations follow the Singapore trajectory to first world living standards? And how will some of those nations manage the challenge of ethno-religious tensions, manifest, for example, in Myanmar, Indonesia, southern Thailand? And can ASEAN and China reach a robust agreement on the management of maritime territorial disputes, and beyond that, a settlement through resource-sharing agreements of those disputes, there being 3 precedents in the region for such settlements? The potential of the ASEAN world has still not fully entered the Australian national imagination. In Southeast Asia, Australia can express its relations with both China and the US. Here we can build our credibility with our partner China and our ally the United States. Australia can make a bigger contribution to global affairs if we maximise our opportunities in the region, demonstrating that there's more dimension to our international character than might at first blush be assumed or than we ourselves have realised. Thank you.